Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I am Maria Gonzalez with SBP. SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we have partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. Next slide, please. SBP has 5 innovations: building efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. Next slide, please. SBP, in partnership with the Walmart Foundation, is excited to announce that our Advise 2025 webinars are now available. Don't miss our next webinar on February 19th, where our disaster advisor, Sherry Risk, will speak on 2 CFR 200 basic requirements. The registration link or QR code will be on the slides we sent out today. Next slide, please. Additionally, thanks to a generous grant from the Walmart Foundation, we have 2 upcoming events in Savannah, Georgia. The first one is on March 4th through the 6th. We will host the CDBG-DR Leader Practitioner course. This 2.5-day course offers a unique learning experience. It provides practical experience and insight from successful recovery leaders to help improve the performance of recovery programs nationwide. The course empowers leaders to build predictable, highly effective long-term recovery programs for their communities. It brings government leaders from around the country into one room to learn, interact, and collaboratively tackle some of their community's biggest recovery challenges. This is offered to state and local agency leaders who manage long-term disaster recovery programs. The next one is May 20 to the 22nd, and it's our response to recovery leader practitioner course. It's also a 2.5-day course. It's a comprehensive program that equips community leaders and emergency management practitioners with the knowledge to enable adequate recovery support and increase disaster resilience. It focuses on investment in recovery and mitigation grant opportunities established for disaster-impacted states, tribes, territories, and local jurisdictions following a major disaster. The course brings leaders from around the country together in one room to learn, interact, and collaboratively tackle some of the biggest challenges facing their communities immediately following a major disaster. This is offered to government, community, and nonprofit leaders responsible for leading disaster recovery efforts. If you wish to attend any of these courses, please reach out to me or simply use the QR code or link to register, which will be available on the slides. Next slide, please. Following us on LinkedIn and Facebook is one of the simplest ways to stay updated on what the Advise team is up to on social media. We encourage you to connect with us. Next slide. Now I will pass it over to our government advisor, Aaron Gagne.
Good morning, and thank you, Maria. Thanks for such a big crowd to join us today. My name is Aaron Gagne. I'm a government advisor with SBP. And we're going to spend some time today talking about designing a CDBG-DR program for success. A little bit of art to it, a little bit of science to it. Obviously, there's some regulation to it. but we're coming about it from a perspective of looking for outcomes, mitigating risk, and really trying to apply a lot of lessons learned. So what we're going to cover why program design matters, and really sort of how that program design from very early on in the process impacts what your program looks like over time. What are some of the basic requirements? What can you do? What can you do with disaster recovery funds, CDBG-DR funds? They're a specific flavor of federal money, and as such, they have specific requirements. Sometimes this is in opposition to or complementary to of what should you do with those funds. So we want to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about risk as a recurring theme because how you design a program really has a lot to do with the types of risk and different risk points that you will either mitigate or incur over the course and the lifespan of a program. We want to talk about avoiding distraction and maintaining a focus. CDBG-DR programs, typically from inception to closeout, somewhere in the range of about 7 years long, can be extraordinarily complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. It's very easy to lose sight of the target, to get distracted and lose focus, and it gets a lot more complicated, gets a lot more risky, and you've got a lot of dollars on the line. So we want to talk about what that means. What are some of the next steps? Where do you go from here? And then what are some of the potential resources that are available to you or to community members, to stakeholders, and certainly to grantees when it comes to program design? Just to give you a snapshot of context, to know I'm not just necessarily a talking head to show up this morning. I'm new to SBP, so you might not have heard my name and seen my face with SBP before. But I spent about 20 years as a grantee, so a couple of decades in the HUD grantee world, but I spent the last decade with HUD as a regional director and also with the Office of Disaster Recovery. So I've got a little bit of background in this. I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, some of the minefields, and some of the best practices, and have had the privilege to see, frankly, both sides. So we're going to try to bring some of those lessons learned. So why does it matter? Why does that initial setup, why does that initial program design really matter? Well, at the end of the day, it's about time to recovery. It's about shrinking that time to recovery, shrinking the time between disaster and recovery. That's what SBP is all about, but that's really realistically what your program should be all about. It's about serving those beneficiaries. It's about identifying the beneficiaries. It's about reaching those beneficiaries. It's about reaching those individuals and families who are least likely to self-recover. And that's a concept as well as a term of art that is really, really important to keep in mind at every step of the way. You know, we have communities and pockets within communities that are well heeled and well insured, and you know what, they probably don't need CDBG-DR help. We have other pockets that are not well heeled, that are not insured, that really have no hope of self recovery. And those are the areas where we seek to make our investments. And frankly, those are the areas where CDBG dollars are intended to be expended. Those are the most impacted and distressed, that term of art from the CDBG program, CDBG-DR program, that most impacted and distressed area that we look to target. The dollars are stretched. You've got to get the biggest bang for your buck. CDBG-DR grants will never cover everything. They will never address all damage. They will cover a portion of the damage. They will cover a portion of unmet need. You know, grants are delivered to a community and allocations are made, and communities sit there and look at a total and say, well, that's not enough. Well, it was never intended to fix everything. It's intended to meet the most basic needs of the people who need the most help. So you have to learn how to stretch those dollars and implement those the most effectively as you can. Risk mitigation. Again, I'm going to keep highlighting that word risk as we go through this. It's a question of not opening yourself to undue risk. So as you design your program, are you going to incur additional risk by taking on types of projects that are riskier? Are you going to enter into contracts that might have different types of risk? Are you going to take on different geography that might incur different types of risk? Are you physically going to rebuild something in a risky area, in an area that might see repetitive loss from multiple storm instances over years? And then at the end of the day, there's promises, and promises are made, and you're delivering on promises with your program design. There's expectations in a community, and there's expectations of a populace that you're going to deliver with these funds. And those expectations and those promises, that's what you need to deliver on with your program design. That program design sort of sets those expectations up as you develop an action plan, as you move forward in the earliest phases of a program, and that's what people are going to hold you to. So those critical path questions up front. So you get an allocation, you have a storm, you have an event, you're awarded an allocation of funds. Basic questions that you need to start to ask yourself. What is our organizational capacity? Have we ever run a basic CDBG program? Are we an entitlement community? What's our experience with that? Because the entire program, the CDBG-DR program, is built on the foundation of CDBG. Have we ever run a DR program? If so, great. If not, not tragic. But certainly having some CDBG background and experience is pretty darn important. Now, what if you have none? Well, that's going to shape how you build your model, how you build your program. What's your in-house staff capacity? Do we have some technical planners and people with that CDBG experience? Do we have grant accountants, and do we have some specialists in that finance world? Do we have some engineers? Do we have procurement specialists? Can you grow? That's a very, very important question to ask, because a lot of organizations have a phobia against full-time employees and adding full-time headcount. So can you add FTEs, or are you going to have to add term employees? Are you going to have to contract for all staff ads? How is that going to work? Again, critical path questions that you're going to have to ask yourself up front. Is there any appetite to add non-grant funds to the recovery efforts? Is there enough money in a community? Perhaps not general funds, perhaps there's foundation funds, perhaps there's other revenue sources. There could be utility funds that might want to make infrastructure investments, but are there other sources? You sort of have to start to look at big picture and understand that if the CDBG-DR funds are not going to be the be all end all, what are our options for sources and uses to get the biggest bang for our buck and go as far down the road toward a complete recovery as we possibly can? Is there clarity among organizations and or departments for who's going to run the program? Is it obvious? Is there an obvious leader of the program? Or is there some push pull? Is there some competitiveness between departments of who's going to be in charge? Is it a Department of Commerce versus a Department of Community Development versus an engineering shop? Who's going to be in charge? Because there needs to be a clear decision-making pathway to manage and mitigate the program, and therefore manage and mitigate the risk. If you don't have that clear decision-making pathway, and you have sort of a waffly pathway, you're only going to exacerbate risk, and you're going to slow the process down. Remember, we talked about the time to recovery, and adding time to recovery. It plays with people's expectations. It extends a timeline. It increases your risk because it extends contracts. It slows expenditures, and will start to push you up against a 6-year expenditure deadline very quickly. Uh, so the two basic program design questions: what do we want to accomplish, and how are we going to administer it? How are we going to, how is the unmet need uh, analysis informing the program for what we're going to accomplish? So what we're going to accomplish is we're going to build our recovery based on the unmet needs analysis, which informed the allocation of the grant funds. You'll start to see a sort of a logical progression. So the data that fed into the allocation of the HUD funds was based on unmet needs in a community. The unmet needs of the community, therefore, need to feed into how you design your program. Again, these are the gaps. These are the gaps in the community where people are not able to self-recover. What is our project and activity experience? What types of programs can we undertake? What is it going to be all about housing? Do we have significant infrastructure damage in our community? Were there major pieces of infrastructure or public facilities that were damaged that need to be restored in order to put the fabric of the community back together? Kind of a key piece there. If you just put housing back together, but the underlying fabric and functionality of a community is still sort of broken, well, then it needs to be part and part. But you're also making it a little bit more complicated as you go. We'll get to that. Who and where are our most at-risk citizens? Again, we're back to risk. These folks are at risk. These folks may be displaced from homes. These folks may be living in substandard housing with blue tarps on their roofs. These folks may be living in homes that are loaded with mold at this point in time. Are we able to leverage funding? Again, we talked about different sources and uses. And then lastly, what are the political drivers in what we want to accomplish? Are there small p or large p politics at play? It's a reality on the street of how we implement our programs. Are there political drivers that are going to shape the design of our program? Swinging back to the other side, how do we want to administer? And who are our partner agencies? Who are our stakeholders? Do we have volunteer agencies? Do we have volunteer long-term recovery groups at the table? Do we have other units of government at the table? If it's a state grantee, who are our local governments? If we're a county grantee, who are our jurisdictions within the county? Are we looking at cities within a county who are our partners? What's our capacity assessment? We talked about that appetite for growth within an organization. Are we going to be able to grow an organization in order to serve the program? Who are our implementation vendors and subrecipients? They these are capacity adds for each of our programs. These are capacity adds as we build our program. Subrecipients, they would receive a chunk of the grant. They might be a housing authority, for example. Housing authority would be assigned a percentage of a grant to go after a specific type of a program. They might administer a single family repair program, or they might administer the development of new multifamily housing. Implementation vendors may come in and literally self-administer a single family repair program across a very large swath of geography. You might contract with shadow staff. You might have shadow staff co-located in a public agency office, in a public agency building. They may be taking in applications. They may be processing applications and processing contracts and processing environmental reviews. There's some pitfalls in that you have to be careful of. You can't delegate inherently grantee responsibilities, inherently governmental responsibilities, but you sure can add a lot of capacity. You can add a lot of capacity without adding full-time employees as well, which makes that sometimes a very appealing approach. And then always keeping in mind that time horizon. I've mentioned that 6-year window a couple of times, and a 7-year, because it usually takes about a year to get to a grant agreement with the federal government. So time of award to federal government gets a grant agreement signed is a year. But then with the DR program, that clock is ticking once you sign that agreement. You've got 6 years to expend those funds. Sounds like a lot of time. It is not a lot of time. It is not a lot of time, particularly with the volume of dollars we're talking about. You look at a county that I've worked with in Florida, $1.1 billion grant awarded to them. We've got 6 years to move $1.1 billion within the boundaries of a county. That's quite an investment. So the can and the should. Let's quickly talk about the can. Regulations are going to drive what you can do. This month, 2025, January 2025, saw the publication of a universal notice. The universal notice set forth even rules and an even playing field for communities that will receive grant funds from this point forward. And the newest allocation of funds was also released this month. That universal notice gives you the rules of the road. It specifically gives you the rules of how to design your program, how to administer your program, what are eligible uses, what are ineligible uses, what are the federal cross-cutting requirements. The allocation announcement notice, that AAN, gets a little deeper into it. It gets into targeted geography. It gets into geographic boundaries and zip codes where the funds have to be spent. Underlying to that, as I mentioned, are the basic CDBG regulations found in 24 CFR 570. If you geek out in community development regulations, you know these. You know 24 CFR 570, and you know Section 105 of the HCDA, the Housing Community Development Act. And in addition to those, there are a set of appendices in the universal notice, the waivers and alternative requirements. Those are very, very important because HUD recognizes that there is no catch-all. There is no one size fits all for every community in every scenario. So there's always a collection of waivers and alternative requirements. Those are packaged as appendices in the universal notice, but these all define what you can do. All CDBG-DR activities must do three things. They must meet a national objective. That is a fundamental pillar of the CDBG program. They must be an eligible activity, that type of activity, that type of investment, or they have to be eligible under one of those waivers or alternative requirements that I referenced. And last but not least for DR funding is they have to address a direct or indirect impact of a disaster. So that's that three-legged stool that comes to play for all CDBG-DR activities. So defining what can be done, we talked about must be done. Well, there's a very wide spectrum of what can be done to invest in DR funds. The question is, how wide a spectrum should you take on? We talked about risk. We talked a little bit about getting distracted. Question then starts to become, well, we've got a very wide spectrum. We can do public facilities. We can do infrastructure. We can do economic development activities. We can do single family housing repair. We can do housing new construction. It's a very, very broad swath, and typically it's a very broad swath of geography as well. So how do you start to narrow it down? So the question then becomes in your program design, how do you narrow it? What happens if you try to jam everything in? We try to jam in the planning, try to jam in the costs of administration, try to run it yourself because you want to try to do it more efficiently. Well, then we're going to hire an implementation contractor because we don't have the inherent capacity to do so. And then we're going to do a competitive award process. And then we're also going to have some subrecipients, and we're going to have some for-profits and some nonprofits and some single family and some multifamily. And you see where this is getting really, really complicated. And you see where the diluted capacity starts to happen. You see where you're starting to get overstretched, and you have a cap on your administrative funds. You can only spend 5% of your grant on administrative costs. That 5% is starting to get chewed up really fast. Your finance and accounting processes are starting to get incredibly complicated. Your accountants are starting to pull their hair out. That's what happened to me. And you're increasing your compliance risk because your program is getting more and more complicated. That means it's getting harder and harder to manage. And at the end of the day, you're watering down your impact because you're having less and less focus. That's the risk of trying to be all things to all people with a program. That's the risk of trying to cram everything in. So, where are we? What do we do? We've got your program. We need to factor in your unmet needs. That's sort of the basis of the program. That's why you were awarded the funds, right? You're awarded a certain amount of funds. You've got 6 years to spend those funds. You've identified who your partners are, depending on where you sit geographically and the type of community you're sitting in, whether it's a statewide organization or a local organization. You've figured out what your political lay of the land is. You've determined what your mitigation requirements are because there's a 15% set aside from your grant to invest in mitigation types of projects. You've identified what your internal capacity is and what your limits are for that. You've thought about what the eligibility for projects are based on connectedness and connectivity to the original disaster and the original event. You've thought about the costs of the types of projects and what sort of people's appetite for seeing how expensive some projects can be. And you've thought a lot about risk tolerance and how your elected officials and how your team is going to accept risk, whether it's monitoring risk, whether it's audit risk, whether it's putting some of your own community dollars on the line, whether it's community risk with, if it's a question of 6 years and you're sitting on a coast in the southeast states, well, you're going to have a whole bunch more hurricane seasons come and go while you're running this program. So you've got all sorts of risk. So all of these are going to come in and feed into your decision-making process as you build your program. So again, circling back to your unmet needs in your disaster impact communities. Let those unmet needs design your program, but let the program become a streamlined one. How do you have the greatest impact for the greatest number of at-risk people? Those people, remember we started this out, those people who are unable to self-recover, those people with the least resources, those people who were most likely to be uninsured at any level, those people with the thinnest safety net or any safety net, financially or socially, those folks who are going to get displaced from a community, those folks who are going to be stuck in unsanitary, unsafe, and unsecure housing, or just simply gone from a community. You're just fundamentally going to lose them from your community. How do you design a reproducible program? A reproducible program is one that becomes a well-oiled machine that shortens contracting and construction administrative timelines so that it becomes sort of a unit pricing where we say, okay, we're gonna, we've got roofs down pat. We know how to pre-qualify roofing contractors. We know how to bid this out. We know how to get those inspections and permits done. And we know how to do a final, and we know how to process that payment, and we know how to process that warranty and maintain that on file. And it just becomes a machine, and it's reproducible, and boom, boom, boom. And each time you're just banging out roofs, and all of a sudden you went from doing 2 or 3 a month to 20 and 30 to 40 or 50 a month, and you're just grinding through these storm damaged roofs because you built a streamlined process that is reproducible throughout your community, that you can just keep grinding. Distractions. We talked about that a lot. And each one of these pieces becomes a distraction. Complicated into small subrecipients. Subrecipients and small activities. Small activities may be a terrific idea, but if you're dealing with a $1.1 billion grant, a nonprofit that comes in and wants a $10,000 sub grant uh, is a really bad idea, because it's going to take more staff time, and it's going to be more of a distraction than the impact of the $10,000. It becomes more trouble than the positive impact that they're going to make with the $10,000. There's ways to do it. And basically, what you need to do is those small entities need to aggregate. They need to aggregate under a common nonprofit, a United Way type of organization, some other type of larger organization that can aggregate those small needs, those small demands, those small activities. But you as a grantee can't build that into your program. It is too complex to navigate. The reporting alone it is too much of a distraction. Too many procurement actions. You don't want single roof procurements. You want to buy 50 roofs at a time. You don't want to buy one manufactured housing unit. You want to buy 10 at a time. You want to aggregate these, and you want to ball them together, and you want to do them in larger buckets because it's more efficient. You can negotiate for a better price. You can pre-qualify with larger entities and larger contractors, and you can speed that process along. Muddied decision-making processes. Remember, we talked a little bit about an unclear or a muddied pathway for decision making, and sort of too many people at the table, or an unclear assignment of responsibilities. Well, that will slow you down every day. And if you don't have that clarity, it's going to be challenged. We used to like to call it the ask mom or ask dad game. If you didn't get the answer you liked, you just went to someone else and you asked the same question, and you kept shopping around until you got the answer you wanted. Inadequate internal resources. We thought we could manage it internally, but we couldn't. And we waited too long. We waited until we were in a deep hole. We do have inherently governmental functions, however, that you cannot delegate. There are things like environmental reviews. There are things like procurement actions that you cannot ask a contractor to do. That must be done by a public official. So you have to staff to a certain level, and you have to staff to a level that is sufficient to carry out the baseline requirements of a program. Activities difficult to quantify accomplishments. Now remember, these are national public dollars. So there's an expectation that there's reporting, and there are outcomes, and there are wins that are being tallied and tabulated and reported on. You have to be able to quantify those. You have to be able to report on those. You have to be able to show a start and an end date to a program, and you have to be able to point to those successes. If the types of activities that you take on in, for example, what may be termed an economic development program, if you can't quantify the benefits and the accomplishments of that program and show a start date or an end date, you're going to have a very hard time showing how that program succeeded at all. And the general lack of focus of an organization. We've seen programs where a CDBG-DR grant was awarded, and it was simply treated as an other duty as assigned within an organization. CDBG-DR is too big for that. It is far too big for that. It's too complicated for that. The regulations are too complicated for that. It cannot be treated as an also-ran. It needs to be treated with enough seriousness to dedicate staff and resources and skill and brain power and publicity and decision making in order to be a success, ultimately to help those people recover and to help the folks that, again, are least likely to be able to self-recover on their own. So we're going to start to get into some takeaways, and we're going to start to wrap this up. Want people to start to jot down some notes into chat if they can. Would really like to have a little conversation, as you will. But streamlining, if an activity, if a step in your action plan, if a process isn't advancing the mission, why are you doing it? If you're undertaking a program or a piece of a program is not advancing the mission, stop. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? Is this a regulatory requirement? Well, that's part of the mission. But otherwise, you don't have time for that. You don't have time in your 6 years. You don't have budget for that kind of a distraction. Just stop that. Limit the number of activities to few and keep the size of those large. The very most efficient programs, the very most effective programs that we've seen nationwide across what now is a portfolio of CDBG-DR programs in excess of $100 billion are programs that undertake one, maybe two types of activities. Programs that will do housing, full stop. That's it. They'll do housing. And they will do it extraordinarily well. They will become absolute robotic specialists in housing. They will have prototypes of stick-built and manufactured housing. They will have prototypes of multifamily housing. They will have pre-qualified cadres of contractors. They will have pre-approved and pre-vetted contracts that they can shop around. And they will efficiently deliver that housing. We've seen some of those programs open and close in 3.5 years. They'll fully expend their grant because they will have delivered on all of their housing promises and expended every nickel of their funds that fast. Even though they had 6 years, they deliver. Holding contractors and partners aggressively accountable. Holding contractors accountable, it's a little easier than holding partners accountable. Contractors liquidated damages and by God, living to it. Holding people to the provisions of their contract, holding them to the performance standards of a contract. Just because you're a public entity, just because you're a grantee, doesn't mean you shouldn't perform at any lower level or hold anyone to a different standard than any high-performing business should. And partners need to behave the same way. If you're going to engage with a subrecipient, who's another public agency, a housing authority, a nonprofit, they need to be held accountable as well in their own processes, in their own accountability, in their own reporting, because their performance is your performance, and you will be measured by theirs. Developing, adopting, and living by comprehensive policies and procedures. You don't ever have to develop these by scratch. The program's been around for 20 years plus at this point. And there are outstanding examples around the country, excellent examples with peer grantees that can be borrowed, modified, cleaned up, and reused. And your peers, they're thrilled to help. They're absolutely thrilled to help. Being transparent in your communication with your leaders and stakeholders and constituents. Public input processes are there for a reason, and the public input requirements and stakeholder communication requirements that you find in regulation are minimums. Those are absolute minimums. High performing grantees communicate more, not less. They communicate with their stakeholders on a regular and rolling basis. They get that feedback. They make course corrections as necessary. And as something may be getting some negative feedback or some negative press, they ask themselves hard questions of why, and they make adjustments or communicate better to get things back on the rails. And last but not least, HUD gives you the rules. HUD gives you the rule books. They give you the monitoring checklist. They give you the templates for action plans. They give you the templates for amending action plans. Before they ever show up to monitor, they tell you specifically what they're going to monitor, and they provide you with the checklists that they're going to use to monitor. So there is never a surprise with what they're going to review. However, it seems like grantees are very often surprised and caught off guard, which doesn't really make a lot of sense when all those materials are provided. So where do you go from here? Dig into that new universal notice. It's a little heavy. We're happy to help. There's a lot we can bring to the table. HUD is doing a lot of rollout with HUD-sponsored briefings. If you get on that Office of Disaster Recovery webpage, you'll find recorded rollout briefings as well as more to come. Pay a lot of attention to the appendices and those linked documents because there's a lot of cross-linked information there. Those templates and the checklists that I mentioned are all found on that Office of Disaster Recovery website. So again, there's no surprises in there. This is an evolving process. The universal notice, as well as the most recent allocation, was rolled out within a week of each other at the beginning of this month. So it is still a very dynamic time within the CDBG-DR program. Over $12 billion was rolled out in the last round, with I think it was 49 new grantees across the country. So it's a little busier than it has been of late. And last but not least, SBP's leader practitioner course, as Maria brought up. Strongly encourage attending that or availing of some of the other SBP resources that we've got lots of links. Look for the QR codes. Reach out to Maria, reach out to myself, and ask for help. We're here to help. That's what SBP does. We're here to help communities and grantees shrink the time between disaster and recovery. You've got peers out there across the country with decades and billions of dollars of experience that love to share their story and love to help. We can help you connect to them, but they're not hard to reach, and they're not hard to engage with. but ask for help. And sometimes that's the hardest thing, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed. But that's why we're here. So, Maria, I think we're at a point where we can start to open things for questions if we have something or anything in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Erin. There is nothing in the chat. However, if there are any questions that pop up after we end this session, please do not hesitate to contact Erin, or myself or anyone from the advice team. Erin, if you can go to the next slide. All right, as a reminder, please join us for our next webinar in February. Next slide. Don't forget to register to one of our courses. As I mentioned in the beginning, and Erin also mentioned, if you have any questions about these courses, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide. These are all our advice offering. If you want to learn more about that, about them, sorry, please contact me or anyone from the advice team. Next slide. Don't forget to follow us on social media. Next slide. We look forward to meeting with you on future webinars or in person at one of our courses. We will email today's slide deck, so look for that in your inbox. Again, we want to thank you on behalf of SBP and the Walmart Foundation. Have a great rest of your day.